Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. We did kind of miss out on capitalizing the milestone of the last episode being episode 256. We were joking a little bit about that in the Discord, but we just we just didn't even think about it when we were rolling.
Yeah, I
Uh,
noticed it afterwards when I was setting up the
yeah,
episode. I'm like, oh, that was 256. There we go.
yeah. I made a joke when someone brought it up that like going forward, we're gonna make our episode numbers, one shifted by the episode number. So next one or this one will be 512. Not gonna,
Yeah,
but
we'll
no, we're not
really,
gonna do that. It would
boost
be
our
funny though.
numbers.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. We'll get into the millions real quick.
yeah, we'll quickly find out which podcast platforms support big numbers.
Yeah, see if we can find some int overflows with the podcast. We'll be very meta about it.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, no, thought that'd be a fun thing to bring up really quick. The other thing I'll quickly mention is we are still experimenting a little bit with changing the format of the podcast to make it a little bit easier to listen to and whatnot. So we would still appreciate some feedback, whether that be in YouTube comments or in our Discord. All right, so we have a few interesting topics this week. Starting out, we have one that you found interesting, Z, which was exploiting Android Client WebViews with help from HSTS. And it's got a bit of that fun aspect of abusing security features in order to make an exploit work. So I'll let you talk about what you found interesting about it.
Yeah, and it was exactly that. Just their usage of the HSTS preload list, which is I forget exactly what I should have just looked it up before the episode, what exactly it stands for, but that's your preload list so that when you try and access that domain, the browser already knows that like that is going to be accessed over HTTPS by default. And it'll automatically do that without you ever needing to like do that HTTP to HTTPS redirect. Uh yeah, I really should know
Are
what
you
that
thinking of
stands for.
HSTS?
Yeah.
Or
Like that's what
HTTP
the
strict transport security?
Okay, yeah, basically saying always use that. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that, like it's been around for a while. I know the term, I know what people are talking about with it, but couldn't tell you what the whole thing meant. So anyway, that's what they end up abusing with this. I thought it was a neat little chain regardless. It is a kind of classic Android sort of bug where you have an application that has a or well, it accepts an intent here, this Android scheme, Tacopedia Android internal, and basically that leads into or it'll do some parsing on that intent when it comes in and it'll try and handle any of those URLs. The idea being for deep linking into the application, have this link somewhere on the web and it can still load up, or they can use it internally to link around it. They have a bunch of parsing around that, and part of the parsing or one of the things that they found was that there was this WebView KYC page, which could be used to, or would load a web view with like a custom web view, I should say. And custom web view is another one of those classic sort of Android attack surfaces where if you can get a custom web view loaded with your own domain, if they're using a custom web view, there's a reason they're using a custom web view. And one of the common reasons is that they can inject a little JavaScript like object or API that can be called from the web app to communicate with the higher level app. And oftentimes with that, we've talked about other vulnerabilities in the past, like I want to say it was the Galaxy Store, like whatever they call that there, where you could basically install APKs through exactly that sort of thing. The custom web view included the API that could just install apps. I think it
I
might have been
remember
able
that
to
one.
uninstall too. But like
Yeah.
very, very privileged actions through the JavaScript API. So if you're able to load a page that shouldn't be loaded and still get to inject that um still get to inject the API or whatever it's adding in there, there's a good chance for privilege escalation. That's exactly what happened here. They had some bad URL validation. So the URL is coming from the intent. They have the example here where the Talkpedia Android internal link exists. It has a URL parameter, and that's where they're getting the final URL to load. It does some checks to be like, is this actually Talkopedia? Which literally would just check, does the domain or does the host end with .talkopedia.com? So making sure it ends appropriately. And it also had a check to make sure it started with HTTP, but it did make sure it started with like HTTP colon slash slash or HTTPS more likely colon slash slash. Just made sure it started with HTTP. So their bypass ended up being this fun little URL with http.com question mark colon slash slash talkopedia.com. So now the host, basically the URL parse that exists on Android, like URL dot or URI.parse, is very forgiving with inputs. It'll just try to come up with something. You're saying it needs to be parsed as a URI, it'll do something. So they were able to basically get the host to be, it would think it's Talkopedia, but when it actually gets loaded into the browser, it does something else. In this
That's
case,
the
it would
part that I thought was fun, was the URI class being used for the validation, where, they link off to the URI class documentation, which explicitly says that in the interest of performance, this class performs little to no validation. So it's, one of those classic misuses where the documentation kind of shouts at you what the issue is with using that in like a security context. But, that's common. Obviously, we've seen that before, but it
yeah,
is funny when you do see it.
I mean, it's rough regardless because you're going to end up with like it's a parser differential basically. The URI parser and the parser that the actual like web view is using are different. And therefore
Yeah.
like you can't necessarily see exactly what the URI or exactly what the web browser is going to load until it's kind of loaded it there. Uh
You got that
but
chicken
yeah.
and egg kind of problem. Yeah.
Yeah, well you just have different parsers that like even if this bug was there, there's a chance there could have been other differentials between them, as there's
For
always
sure.
seem to be uh like a lot of complexities when it comes to URL parsing. So it's hard to do and there isn't like a standard way of doing it. But anyway, the issue that they kind of ran into was they could get this domain, but if they started this as the web view would only load HTTPS pages, they'd get this, clear text not permitted, which is default with the web views to not allow clear text or HTTP pages to be loaded. But if they included like HTTPS colon slash slash, this trick wouldn't work anymore. Where they're basically, abusing the fact that it's parsing the schema as like this very weird thing. This trick wouldn't work if they actually put like HTTPS, so they can't tell it to load an HTTPS page. So how do they get around that? They get around that by using the strict transport security or HSTS, and using the preload list, getting their domain preloaded. And they basically just created this HTTPS redirector site, like whole service to do an HTTPS preloaded website that'll redirect wherever you want. They created that service and were able to use the preloading to get it as HTTPS initially as the initial load, and thus get access to that privileged API, which gave them the I believe it was an account authorization token out of using that API. So they're able to get the account hijack. I thought it was fun, but just the general flow there. It is kind of a classic thing when it comes to Android bugs, but using the HSTS to get around or to get HTTP is a nice little trick to at least be aware of if you run into that sort of situation, because web views do generally require that you be on HTTPS. So, something to be aware of. Cool little trick. Yeah, I thought it was interesting, even though it's not a terribly complicated issue here. Like it is a pretty classic, um, just bad URL parsing is kind of the fundamental issue.
Yeah. Like you said, I like the tricks that were involved here. So, yeah. With that said, we can move on to our next topic, which also deals with URLs and kind of the mishandling with them. And it's one of the more popular topics that has been circulated around, and it's using YouTube to steal your files. So this is abusing the ability to embed YouTube videos into your slides in Google Slides, and basically utilizing that to enable a clickjack attack. So they started off with experimenting, like what can you do with these YouTube embeds? Obviously you can add a video, but what happens if you don't link it to a video ID, but some other URL on YouTube, like try to path traverse into the parent page? So the parent page wouldn't work. It would refuse to connect. That's just because of things that YouTube has to prevent clickjacking explicitly. But one of the more interesting places you can
To
go
prevent
is
iframing
redirect.
specific. specifically,
Yeah, sorry,
which prevents
yeah, iframe.
clickjacking. But yeah, it's the iframe that's the
Yeah,
problem.
yeah. Um, but yeah, so one of the places you can redirect though that was interesting is the sign-in flow, where they would have the parameter to redirect you back to where you were. But it had to be any YouTube subdomain. So using that, they found another redirect, which is the accounts.youtube.com subdomain. And this one was a little bit better in that it wouldn't only go to YouTube, but you could also go to other Google domains, such as Docs itself. And one Docs endpoint that was particularly useful is Edit, which lets you preview and perform actions like sharing. That didn't immediately work on its own because of some mitigations that Google has in place. They have this sec fetch site header, which is checked against the origin, and if the origin is outside of docs, then it won't load,
Yeah,
or it'll
can I
403.
I just want to kind of jump in and talk a little bit because I thought this was interesting. The endpoint that they end up using, you call it as edit. I'd maybe refer to it more as like this file, because what they seem to be doing is, or the interesting thing on this basically seems to be mirroring the drive.google.com/file endpoint, where you'd have a file, you give it the file ID, edit, where you can kind of do like the previewing, but kind of mirrors the full drive interface of like previewing the file on docs, or maybe not mirroring, but like it's doing that sort of access.
It's sort of emulating it. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that. That's a good point.
Yeah, and I thought that was kind of an interesting thing because I'm guessing there are other domains that maybe have some similar sort of mirrors going on that might be useful to be aware of. But yeah, in this case, like that's kind of what's going on with this edit page. It's not some specific docs thing, it is kind of drive that's perhaps being the issue here. I don't know if I'd necessarily call it drive. I don't know what their code base looks like, so who knows, but I did
Yeah,
find that functionality to be interesting.
but that is important to note because this URL, despite the fact that it's on the docs subdomain, is able to share drive files like anywhere on drive, not just things that are on docs. So that kind of makes it a lot more useful as well. But yeah, so like I mentioned, they have that sec fetch site header that they have to get around, so they can't immediately redirect to uh, this docs edit endpoint. They have to get there through docs directly. So the way they do that is they found this old G Suite URL format where you would have like /a/ and then like the organization, or you could just have another A if you were logged in. And it seems that to support that older format, or to glue it, it would basically just redirect you and strip that part out of the URL. So by just adding that /a in early on in the URL, you can get docs to redirect you back to that same edit page, and then you can pass that security check and everything works out.
Yeah, and for
And
what
for
it's
whatever.
worth, I'm not
Yeah,
sure if that's actually legacy. Like maybe it is, but I know I still see links like that coming from Google with like the domain in there. Um, so I still see Google using this, so I'm not sure if it's actually legacy or not, or if it's just like they weren't seeing it. Not super important to the bug, but I did just want to call that out.
yeah, well, actually I'm just trying to find it because the blog post kind of calls this out too. uh
I guess they do have a edit here that says and still does, so maybe they do.
that
Uh,
that's exactly what I was looking for, thank you. um
yeah, switch your
Advaith let me
account.
know that they automatically switch your account to the one under the domain. Okay, yeah, so it's used for the multi-accounting. Okay, so yeah, it is sort of they call it as legacy, but it is sort of repurposed or multi-purposed, so that's why it's still there.
Yeah, the A slash
um
A is interesting though. That that feels like
that one
I
is
don't know if
interesting.
it's supposed to work that way or if it just like if it doesn't
If
match
it's just like a
anything, it
fallback
does some.
handler.
Yeah, like I wonder what's
Yeah,
going on with that because that is kind of a that one feels like a bit of an interesting trick, but nonetheless, they were
for
able to
sure.
use that as a nice redirect here.
Yeah. uh so there was sort of another interesting part of this where if you just use like the typical edit endpoint, you set the users to invite and the sharing action, it would basically, you would have to perform 2 clicks as the victim to make this go through, because it would say that this person asked to be an editor. You would have to click review and then click done. If you just omitted the other query parameters and just kept the users to invite, it would pre-fill them and wouldn't ask you to review them. That seems like a kind of a weird, like, front end sort of bug. But it's a nice trick because it essentially takes their 2 click attack down to a 1 click, where all they have to click is the send button, which is pretty useful because when you look at how they finalize this and put their finishing touches on, they basically just isolate their frame down to that send button and then dress the frame up as like a form submission. So it looks like you're clicking send to submit a form action instead of, sharing a secret file. So yeah, ultimately this does turn into like an iframe clickjacking attack, but the way that it works is pretty cool. And it's nice to see how these kinds of redirects can be abused uh, to get around sort of like trusted flows, where you should be able to trust the contents of that YouTube frame being an act like a YouTube video or something, but by abusing these clever redirects, you can uh, eventually take that into a clickjacking attack. So yeah, it was pretty cool, and it netted them a $4,100 bounty.
Yeah, and one of the things I found interesting on this was that use of the redirects. Going through so many just and the fact this starts off with a client-side path traversal, generally pretty minimal sort of issue, but you take that little path traversal, you get it to a redirect. That redirect can only go, on your own. Well, I guess not so much that redirect, but the path traversal is only going to land you on the same domain, and kind of doing this little privilege, or not necessarily privilege escalation, but this little escalation of redirects until you're able to get it to something useful. And that kind of ties in with something they bring up right at the start was, in security research, they often come across these weird quirks and behaviors that aren't necessarily useful, at least not immediately, but sometimes they end up being just that missing link you needed when you're coming up with something else. And this is kind of their example of that's a very true thing. Like oftentimes it's as you're doing your research, come across like, oh, this is weird, this is a bug or perhaps a bug, but it's not a security issue, and so it doesn't get reported, doesn't get dealt with. And then over time, it's like, oh, now that little bug is actually something that, I could use, create security impact later on. Which is what I found really interesting out of this whole post was that kind of escalation of those redirects to eventually get in there. I do also like their visualization of the clickjacking. I don't know if they're necessarily the first to show it this way, but when you hover, kind of see exactly how they redress the UI. I'll be honest, I haven't looked and read a lot of clickjacking write-ups, so maybe that's just a common thing, but I thought it was neat seeing it here. Um,
It's a
and yeah,
very cool
they
visualization. Yeah.
yeah, and they did get a 31 3133.7. They got a $3,100 bounty plus $1,000 bonus on this too, so that's always nice.
Yeah, you've got that Google tagged value where they always do the 337s in their payouts.
Yeah.
It's fun, but it's annoying to pronounce it that way all the time, so I always just round it. Yeah. Um, but yeah. All right, so getting into our last topic, and this is one that I'm sure many of the listeners have probably heard about, is the attacking Unix systems via cups, which was published by EvilSocket. So this was a pretty hyped up vulnerability, which there's been a lot of like controversy around and whatnot. But essentially, what it is, covering some of the background, is a series of 4 vulnerabilities in cups, which is an open source printing system. I believe it was developed by Apple, which when you chain together these vulnerabilities under the right circumstances, it could allow installation of malicious printers on a victim machine, which, if a print job can then be triggered, can be used for getting code execution. So I'm not going to get too into like the depths of all the vulnerabilities here, but I do want to cover it a little bit because it's relevant for some of the discussion around it.
Just before you
So,
do, I do want to say like
yep.
Cups' common Unix printing system. I'm not sure if Apple maybe did one of the first implementations there. I hadn't actually heard that. Kind of start with Apple because the implementation here that we're kind of dealing with is coming from GNU. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean it.
Yeah,
I
so
don't know
I
what
just
the his.
confirmed my uh reading of it, it was developed by Apple for iOS, iPad OS, and Mac OS. So yeah,
Yeah,
it
okay.
was
'Cause, I
kind of
mean,
kickstarted by Apple.
yeah, okay. I wasn't sure of the history on that. But nonetheless, the one that they're actually targeting though is GNU uh
Yeah.
Linux version here. So
Though to be fair, I believe there is a second blog post that's expected to come out that does talk about this in the context of macOS.
yes,
So that does seem like something that's in the pipeline.
yeah, they bring it up as impacting. Yeah, part two we'll discuss. Uh, goes into better cap to attack OS X, or well Mac OS. So yeah, there is that aspect. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's go ahead and actually talk about the issue.
Yeah. So the relevant details here is the fact that the first vulnerability is this cups browse daemon binds on UDP port 631 with basically no authentication, and it binds on all addresses. It binds on 0.0.0.0 rather than just localhost, for example. And this is somewhat significant because, for one thing, this service is C based and it looks to be fairly weak in terms of code quality. They actually go into a section in this write up where they fuzzed this service and found some memory corruptions like stack overflows. But even beyond that, um, it can also give a foothold to access some other vulnerabilities just from its regular functionality, where if you're able to get a packet to it that contains a URL to presumably a printer, the daemon will connect back to that URL where it'll report the kernel version and the architecture and the user agent, which is, kind of an info leak on the system. But also by hosting an IPP server on the malicious host, you could respond to that request in a useful way where you can get attributes maliciously passed back, which would get passed into PostScript printer description or PPD files, which is basically like a domain specific language where you can get directives executed when that printer is used in a print job. Uh, and the specific protocol they use to take advantage of this here is Fumatic. So by using the Fumatic RIP command line directive, you can basically get command execution for free when that PPD is evaluated, when the fake printer is used for a print job. Now, part of why I cover that information is that, like I said, this vulnerability is being hyped up pretty massively on Twitter and other platforms. It was initially scored as a 9.9 CVSS score by Red Hat researchers, and Evil Socket, the researcher in question here, has been bringing a lot of attention to it. He was expressing frustration on Twitter with, his reports not being taken seriously enough and wanting them to be fixed. And it was sort of picked up by media outlets and whatnot as a doomsday bug. Because, if you initially read it and you're just like, oh, hey, this can be used to remotely hit like any Unix machine, without some of the context, like, you could see how that would be taken as a very serious problem.
Yeah,
Um,
I've pulled up the tweet here, and basically this is unauthenticated remote code execution on all GNU/Linux systems.
yeah,
That is a extreme sounding thing. And I do want to, because they do call out here, still no CV assigned, but there should be at least 3, possibly 4, ideally 6. I mean, when I read these CVs as they stand, um, like the first CV here, 47,176 for this year. I'm just going to pull it up on NVD also. Like they seem to describe this issue more or less as, the problem is that it's listing on any address or like, quad zero sort of deal. And like that doesn't feel like a CV to me. I would grant like CV worthiness, I guess, on the fact that there is a URL request, so it is kind of like server-side request forgery in that sense. But just the whole CV choices here, like on what they're granting the CV to. Because the other thing they do is like it does not validate or sanitize the attributes, which is a little bit like creating a CV for like in PHP application if it uses like the $ post and like gets the thing without sanitizing it. But really the vulnerability or CV should be where it uses it without that, which it is. Like there is a further CV Um, that is like what, because it wasn't validated or sanitized, it now can be injected. It just feels weird to have a separate CV that's just for the fact that it's using it without validation. Granted, people can like CVs just for tracking things, so whatever. But oh no, it just feels like every stage of this issue is getting one rather than kind of the core functionality issue. Oh
Yeah,
no, felt a little
I
bit
thought that
weird for me.
was I
And
thought that
they,
was kind of interesting too. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to mention they call out the fact that the user agent contains like the Linux ID, and it's like, well, this got ignored. It didn't get a CVE for it, and this is very similar to like Apache would have a server header that would or could include version information about like the Apache server being used. Nginx had the same. PHP has like the X powered by header. And I would agree that these are potential issues and like it is an information disclosure, it is an issue, but I'm also not surprised that somebody would decide this isn't really worth a CV or this isn't worth uh doing much about, because it's a technical issue, but similar to like open redirect, it's an issue but only combined with actual issues.
Yeah,
The
it's not high
fact that
impact on
you,
its own.
yeah, like the fact that it's this version is an issue because it is disclosing something that ideally you wouldn't know from the outside. But the only way you could use that information is combined with an actual vulnerability in like that version or something, which means like you can do automate scanning, it enables a bunch of things. But it is the sort of issue that often gets rejected and overlooked. And just because of the fact that it matches pretty well with the CWE, I don't think means therefore it's a CVE. Um,
Yeah, and I'll just take a quick side note to say that I hate CWEs. I've seen people try to argue about them and say like, "Oh, this is a CWE, so it's a vulnerability," and it's just like CWE is so broad and generic. I really don't like when people like try to make arguments based on CWE.
Oh,
I
CWE is
don't.
useful. CWE is absolutely useful for actually classifying issues. Now, you do talk about something being like really generic, but that's the thing. Like the way the numbering works is basically have these top level, insanely generic things, and then they're going to have child and children under them until you get to much more specific things.
Oh,
So
I
like
understand that,
there's a
but basically
use
what
when
I'm
it comes to trying to classify vulnerabilities, but I wouldn't go in the other direction. It's a vulnerability because it can be classed as a CWE.
that's
Like,
what I mean. I don't like that reasoning.
yeah, like a
Um,
weakness can be a vulnerability, but not all weaknesses are vulnerabilities.
yeah. But yeah, like you said, I found it somewhat interesting because I kind of took it at face value when I first started covering this, where I was like, yeah, there's this chain of 4 issues. It does get a little bit interesting about which, like, if each of those stages is an issue. Like what you said with binding on an address any, like, because it was kind of interesting. Evil Socket made a tweet about this. Um, the fact that the C-based daemon is even running on a port that's easily accessible and seems to be pretty easy to trigger memory corruption issues in, that is a valid concern, I think, and it is worth bringing up.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
said,
But the vulnerability are those buffer overflows. Or,
yeah,
like I said, it does include the fact that this triggers the get printer attributes, which results in the URL request, which is totally fair to go and call like a CV, give that an SSRF sort of issue. Like it's there,
yeah,
it's just the emphasis. So I mean, it's kind of nitpicking on my side to be like, oh well, the emphasis of the writing isn't quite what I'd like. So I'm being very nitpicky on that. To be fair, like I mean, ultimately it has a CV, and that means it gets tracked, and that's all it really means. Like a CV just means this is an issue somebody decided was worth tracking with a number. That's it.
yeah.
So I can't be like it doesn't. It just they do feel where they chose to kind of draw the line on these feels a little bit weird. Like I mentioned the sanitization thing. Um, the usage of it not being sanitized is more the issue to me and what I'd like to see, but somebody disagrees. But in terms of all the drama around this thing, changing topics a little bit, They mentioned Canonical and Red Hat and others confirmed severity 9.9. So that was the severity on one of the vulnerabilities, which frankly I don't think makes a ton of sense here.
No, that's a bad CVSS score.
The CVSS scoring just seems so wild. I'm trying to find where they have all the, here we go. So I guess this ended up getting leaked early because it ended up on breach forum where somebody had the original report copied in there, and they have all of this. Actually, does he have a better image with all the, there we go. They have an official image here with Red Hat with all of the CVSS scores. And it's just the command execution that results in a 9.9 score. And 9.9 sounds like a very bad vulnerability. I'm just going to pull up a CVSS3 calculator here. But what they've got on this one, now I need to find the page again, is like access vector network. Whereas the actual command execution, like basically I could criticize almost every point of the CVSS score because, and this is kind of a larger issue with CVSS because CVSS does not capture entire chains of issues. CVSS is really just score the one CVE. So you can have a chain that ultimately results in this being remote, but the command execution here requires you have the printer added, requires that malicious PPD file be there already on the system, and then somebody triggers the print using the PPD file. So it actually, like, it's not...
It's wrong on like every metric because user interaction is set to none. That's not true. You do need like someone to trigger the print. It has the access vector as network, but
yeah, and I could agree to calling like the whole chain as network. I like,
yeah,
fair enough. The whole chain accessible over network. It's just CVSS that's only with like this one smaller issue of the thing there. Privileges required, you need to be able to print, so there is something. And yeah, user interaction. One thing that I found really interesting when I was speculating, initially I had some speculation about, well, what is the issue or where is the issue? Not so much what it is. Wouldn't be able to tell that. And I had kind of based it on like this question of, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA, as being low, high, low, which I find really weird for a code execution. Because usually code execution means, you're able to run code as whatever that user is. Therefore, you have access to all the data it would have. Therefore, confidentiality is broken. You can edit things. Therefore, integrity and availability. Like, of course, if you're running it as a user, you could also just end the process. Therefore, usually CIA are all high with code execution. So I found this choice to be really weird. That said, I honestly feel like that's just a mistake, but it doesn't. So that would actually raise the score, or could raise the score. Scope was changed, which is another slightly odd thing. Again, coming from the network, I see it as scope change. Coming just from the command execution, you're running it in that same program. You're ending with code execution from that same level. So that one does feel off to me also, but okay. So we've got our 9.9 here. So if we kind of, just reclass this, one, if we give it all highs, because it does result in code execution, that would be a 10. But you definitely need some sort of user interaction to cause the print to happen that uses this PPD file that gets written. Something needs to happen there. So it requires user interaction. That brings it down. User needs to be able to print, needs to be able to like access the printer. So there is at least a low degree of privileges. Not a lot, like, just a user. So there is still low there. So it's dropping it down to 9. Prints, like, it's been a long time since I've worked. I did a little bit of work with cups many years ago where I was doing like a little CTF challenge, like attack defend thing that involved like spoofing prints and well, the fact that it was over UDP could spoof IP and was doing some stuff with that. It wasn't so much like on this code execution, but or on any sort of code execution issue. I guess I'm just not sure if you can really trigger the print completely remote, or if you'd want to call this just as a local thing. If it's local, this becomes an 8.2, but keep it on network,
I would
still
argue
9.
local, probably, but
Local seems to be the way most people have been interpreting this one.
yeah.
So I kind of agree there. And I would say scope unchanged even, which brings us down to 7.3. Uh, but scope change, like this does land as root, so maybe you could, privilege you can maybe make an argument on the scope changed, whatever, keep it 8.2. Still, like, if it landed, if it were advertised as like 8.2, this wouldn't get picked up anywhere near as much.
Or it wouldn't be as like I said, it wouldn't be picked up as like a doomsday bug.
Well, the fact
So
that it hit 9.9 meant that, like, you had CIOs or CISOs picking this up as like, are we vulnerable? Is this something to be worried about? And like creating a lot more drama around it than if this just landed as a pretty normal bug, which it feels like it
yeah.
is. Like, it's still an issue. I'm not going to deny, like, the fact that there's an issue here should be patched, all of that. It's just what landed is kind of like a normal, here's another thing to get patched.
Yeah. So I will say we've kind of talked about this in the past, but I don't really like CVSS as a system. I feel like it leaves out way too much context, and it can lead to like silly situations like this where a bad number is calculated. And the other thing is like a CVSS score. It's not like it's like reviewed or something, or it has to go through some kind of review process. It's just somebody comes up with it and attaches it. Um, and like these metrics, especially in situations like this, are largely left to interpretation on like the heavily weighted metrics. So yeah, like I don't want to rant too much about CVSS. And in fairness to Evil Socket here, he even calls out the fact in the post that he doesn't believe that this should have been scored as a 9.9. Like he says, impact wise, I wouldn't classify it as a 9.9, but then again, what the hell do I know? Saying like, they don't really use this metric or understand it too well, so they'll just kind of take what the Red Hat researchers assigned at face value. And that's why they had repeated it in their tweet. And a lot of people were jumping on this, like saying, haha, 9.9, what a joke. Like, and a big reason for that I didn't really cover before, but you could probably intuit was, there is that UDP port 631 that's binding on any, but like that should be getting firewalled off. I would hope that there aren't like a ton of systems, at least in critical context, that are just listening on port 631 and accepting data through it. Like that should be getting firewalled.
Should be. There
Obviously
definitely
there are
are.
going to be some, yeah, there are definitely going to be some systems that don't. And the post kind of goes into that, like saying I did an internet scan and found like a couple 100,000 devices that I was able to get data back from connecting back. And it's like, okay, on its own, that doesn't really mean very much in my opinion, because you can probably find a couple 100,000 Raspberry Pis where you can log in remotely into a shell with their root account with a default password. Like that doesn't really mean very much. I would be curious on how many actually like enterprise critical systems you would be able to reach using this, because I don't expect the number would be very high.
Well,
Um,
in fairness,
but
though, like for ransomware or for like a, I don't know, miningware. I don't know what people would be calling that, but like for rogue miners or something, like, you access that Raspberry Pi, you
or
start
for like a
mining off it.
botnet,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, botnet would be a good way to just generically put it. Like for that, like there's totally use for all those things. No, they can potentially be compromised, although again, you still need that print to actually happen using the printer you add. Bug lets you remotely
Yeah.
add a printer that will, result in code execution when you print using it. So somebody
Yeah.
needs to also go and print here, which is, the big kind of user interaction issue.
Yeah, so that's kind of the big limitations with this is the fact that you have the firewalling, and even if it's not firewalled off and you can connect to it, you still need that user interaction, which limits the impact pretty severely compared to how it was kind of being picked up as like this doomsday bug where it's like if somebody has your IP address and sends this data to it, you're screwed. That's kind of how it was being shared around. And Evil Saga did admit to like kind of hyping it up a little bit and causing some drama in order to get it fixed because of frustration with the vendors,
But I
you know,
mean, wasn't this
not
getting
fixing it.
fixed already? Like, it seems like
So
they did this
that's kind of where the
disclosure.
disputes kind of come up and where some of the conversations are centered around. So obviously, you know, there was that stuff with the impact. That's
Just before
fine.
we
I
change
think it's
topics, sorry, since you're kind of leading on to something else, I do want to have a last word just on CVSS.
okay.
And
Go
just
ahead.
mention with CVSS, one of the biggest problems is you're mentioning like people use this like, oh, it's 9.9, it's very critical, and like, it doesn't capture a lot of context. And I think one of the important pieces of context that's missing, well, there's two that I tend to bring up. One is the application context. What's important to the application? Because like a confidentiality break or information disclosure can be very meaningless, but it can also be like if the whole application is like a secret storage and it's disclosing all the secrets, it's kind of a bit more critical than just in some random apps, like, the application context. And what matters here is you only really have that attack vector of network, which means it's just listening out to a remote network, and people automatically take that as internet because that's one of the more common ways, but it just means network. And there's no real way of distinguishing between some that is usually available on the wider internet versus something that is purely on the network. So this one being, yes, it's listening, it's there, but you're generally only going to see this if you're already on the network, which makes it useful for like red teaming, for internal pen testing. Totally some use cases there too. Because we talk about like botnets for those on the wider internet, but it on the internal network, there's still the option there. But yeah, with CVSS, it just doesn't really capture that difference. And it can't really. Like it's a really hard thing because that is a deployment or environment area, or the environment of the deployment. It has a hard time kind of capturing some of that, and
And I'm
so
glad
we
you
just
brought
end
that
up with
up.
these scores that feel off.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up because that was some of the discussion I'd seen around too that I hadn't considered when I initially saw this was that sort of difference between like a red teaming type of scenario and like a, you know, attacker trying to hit it from the wide area network. Like, if you're in like a red team scenario or an attacker that's trying to attack like a local network or something, then this becomes a lot more interesting because then you can try to like get a print job triggered. That's a lot more feasible. You can try to add a printer that looks like it would be legitimate on the network. You probably don't have to worry about firewalling, or you probably have some way around it. So that is a good thing that you brought it up. Um, but yeah, like again, you kind of have those nuances that are important that are being dropped when it's being talked about by some of the like media outlets and stuff. But what a lot of the controversy and the like infosec sphere, if you want to call it that, there is some conversation around the disclosure, because the the timeline here is a little bit weird. They say that these bugs were reported on September the 5th, which is when they confirmed their findings and reported it. And they say they won't go into details on the initial conversation, and we don't have the thread, so we're not going to comment on this too much. But it seemed like there was a bit of dispute and back and forth on how serious these issues actually were, and it didn't seem like they were too keen on fixing them. And eventually, obviously, these issues were fixed, and there was like a bit of a coordinated disclosure on this going out. But this all happened within under a month. Like, you went from initial report to like full disclosure and everything in under a month, which is pretty wild. Like, when I consider other topics we've talked about on the podcast over the years, we're talking about a time scale of multiple months, sometimes over a year, not under 1 month.
The disclosure timeline on this was feels relatively quick. Like they got to working on some of these pretty quickly too. I they do mention, like, they call it out as, oh well, the research took a couple days, but this part took 22. Most of this part is you doing nothing as you wait for it to get fixed or resolved or something. Granted, it seems like they've had more conversations we can't see though, so can't really say much there.
Yeah, I mean,
And like,
it does strike me as a little bit weird because in like the posts and in their tweets, they had said they'd gotten a little bit impatient with like this not being fixed. And it's like, well, when you consider the fact that this all happened in under a month, and you're talking about an issue that presumably, like you're alleging, affects multiple different GNU Linux distributions. You have a lot of different vendors in play, all wondering what's going on. Like, I almost feel like your expectations are way too high on expecting like resolution and lots of communication back and forth on fixing this so quickly. So that struck me as a little bit weird. It's I don't know.
Yeah, if
Like
like
I said, I think it's just high expectations.
yeah, and maybe that comes. I did look at their, 'cause they call out how this isn't the first time they've done disclosures. It's been like 8 to 10 years, but they do well, maybe a little bit less than that. I've got one disclosure attempt here in like 2017, 2016. Um, of the ones that they link, I didn't get a date on the first one here, but either way, like it looks like they had some pretty decent timelines on those two. Where one of them they reported on May 11th, 2017, had it acknowledged that they would fix it in a couple of days, and then on the 16th, the 25th, and the 29th, they got no response on their follow-ups, therefore they disclosed it on the 30th. That feels a bit aggressive. I mean, each researcher is definitely like, you get to choose for yourself when disclosure is appropriate. There's no like hard and fast rules. The Project Zero format has been pretty well accepted, of giving roughly 90 days some nuance if they're like actively working and like need a bit more time or something. But yeah, I'm going to agree, like a month is a very short time, especially on something that has a lot of players kind of involved here, because yeah, we've got the initial code base, um but then we've also got everybody that's going to be using the code base and all of the downstream options there.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot going on that needs to kind of happen, and I wouldn't necessarily expect a lot of really quick responses. I would just expect like they start working a little bit and like do some work. Um, and eventually things get done. Sometimes things are slow. Like a 30-day response time is generally pretty good. Uh Paid companies, like when we're talking about Microsoft, we often see faster on some things and not another. Because something like this, it is a more critical issue, so you do expect a faster reach response time. And from like Amazon or like on AWS, you might expect like literally in days things get fixed. Free software, I have a lot lower expectations when it
Yeah, when
comes
you're
to how
talking about like
quickly.
the OSS ecosystem, like open source, like it's things move a lot slower because there's not as many resources going into it. So yeah, and I will say with the 30-day thing, so this is something we'll probably get into in a little bit, but this was disclosed a little bit early because the initial report and proof of concept were leaked, which you had kind of alluded to earlier. But even in the initial report, if you look at the report that was leaked, it was a 30-day deadline. And yeah, like you have a lot of stuff going on downstream. Even still, there's not a lot of clarity on which distributions and which systems exactly are impacted, because it's not even clear like which systems have like cups running and installed by default. It seems like Ubuntu has it going by default, but like other distributions it's just kind of assumed, and there's no clear information on that. And it's just like expecting everything to be resolved in a month is crazy. And I don't really think that that would be gaslighting, like to state that. I don't
Yeah,
really know what they mean by gaslighting. And unfortunately, where we don't have the threads, I guess we can't really comment on that. But
well, one of the
um,
gaslight attempts actually is from this review locking multi-threading link here. Like there is one that is linked. Um, and I think what really happened there is just the developer made a mistake. Like the developer thought and so what I think is going on here, basically developer has the issue here and they pushed a update that fixes one of the vulnerabilities here, adds like some validation around the parameters. And they come in, they have the issue, evil saw comes in, it's like, do you realize there's tons of people observing these repos and report, and um people are watching this and didn't follow the suggested protocol. And I think the developer just made a mistake in terms of pushing this out and it wasn't actually on a private branch. I'm not entirely sure about that. I'm not sure it is public now, but I don't know what it was at the time. But I think that's the gaslighting, where he thinks he's being gaslit because the developer thinks they did this to a private branch. He thinks it went out on public. Otherwise, it could be something about the Mac OS, because he does mention not impacting. Or I thought there was mention in this report.
Well, after the
Here
thread
it
gets
is.
locked, they mentioned that macOS doesn't ship this and uh, effectively prevents these attacks. So I don't know if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, the cups repository is a completely separate project, which is why Mac OS isn't affected and not subject to the GHSAs you filed. It's possible gaslighting. It also sounds like there could have just been a legitimate,
Misunderstanding.
yeah, like
Yeah. So it seems to me like Evil Socket might not be like, he might not be very fair to some of the vendors here.
might not be
Attributing
charitable,
like,
which don't have to be,
yeah,
but like I don't know. I
it helps
read,
everybody if you are.
yeah. I don't want to go too much into it, but you can read some of the other disclosures and some of the other GitHub things and some of the older issues too. Um, Definitely feels like they want things to come through very quickly. Uh,
Yeah, and it's sort of
feels
a,
very
it's sort of
aggressive.
a common issue. It's sort of a common issue in the security space where we like to think that like, oh, I've reported the security issue, you need to make this top priority right now, this is the biggest problem, and you kind of get stuck in that headspace where it's like, well, the research that I'm doing is obviously important, so if I'm telling you about it, you should take it seriously, and if you don't, then it's because you don't think that I'm, important enough or something like that. I think there is kind of that weird headspace that you can get into where it's like developers, they're not like just there to fix security problems. They obviously have to make sure that things work, that fixes that are being integrated are tested and aren't going to break functionality for their end users. And then also making sure that, like, it's not interfering with their development of things that are already ongoing. Like you kind of have that flow where it's a bit of an adversarial relationship between developers and security researchers. And it seems like this is one of those cases where that was taken to an extreme,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
although I will also mention Evil Socket is a developer. Works on Better Cap thing and a number of other things actually. Like has a number of like more development, or like I don't think they're primarily a security researcher at all. I think they're primarily a developer, happen to work on security oriented projects, like Better Cap, but I mean they do development, so I feel like they know the development side and wouldn't appreciate these sorts of things coming towards. Maybe they would. I don't know. I don't know them well enough. That said, like if I saw this in a bug bounty, I think a lot of people would be like, that's just not how you talk to the vendors, basically. Um,
Yeah.
like
It seems like it's maybe a little bit of a experience not syncing up with how it typically is in like the vulnerability disclosure and reporting space.
yeah, like I said,
Like
it
the
seems like they got
expectations aren't
lucky
aligned.
on like some of their
Yeah.
prior disclosures, getting some very quick disclosures. Like I mentioned, the one there was like next day they said, yeah, we'll get on this in a couple days, and they end up doing disclosure the month later, but also had the normal experience of like no response for a week, no response for another week, which is super common. People talk about going months without response, which is a problem. Like I don't want to defend like the developers who just ignore security researchers for months without any update. That is its own issue too. Um
No, but you have to be fair,
yeah, and I
is how
guess
I look at it.
what is fair is kind of up to every person.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
The other aspect I did want to talk about, though, and that does play a part here too, is the fact that this report leaked through Vince, or the Vulnerability Information and Coordinated Environment. Um, so this report was published to breach forums, and it kind of put you again in sort of a weird middle ground where it's like, well, now that it's being circulated on these forums and can be abused, like it's probably in everybody's best interest to go like full disclosure on it, and that is ultimately what happened. They decided, let's publish everything, get the fixes out, and whatnot, because it's been leaked. And that is very interesting
Yeah,
because
the leak is fascinating, that because I haven't really heard
yeah,
of that happening very often. It has
no,
happened, but yeah, not
not in
something
this way
that's.
though.
I think the main reason why this one did though is because it had all of the attention beforehand on this being this 9.9 vulnerability, and like, very problematic. And so somebody with access ended up leaking it. That said, like, the disclosure that they wanted, the 30 days, I think you mentioned, was still in the original report, correct?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, because I didn't see that, so that was information I'm getting from you. I went on breach form, but then I saw you also have to reply to get access to the report, so I just didn't care to uh take a
Yeah,
full
if
look
you
on
if you
that.
look at the original report, just to like expand on it a little bit, um on the section, do you plan to publicly disclose this vulnerability yourself? It says, yes, I already agreed on a 30 days disclosure embargo with the vendor, which will end on October 6th. So it was originally supposed to go public on October 6th, but it went a little bit early because of the leak. In full fairness, I just closed the report. Now I want to open it up again because I believe in the report it does say that they are flexible on extending that if needed.
Okay, so I
Uh,
mean that's where I kind of retract a bunch of things I was saying beforehand. Um,
yeah, so it says I agreed to the 30 day disclosure embargo. I'm open to extending that if anyone needs more time. But that does kind of conflict with what has been said around this after the fact, so it's a little bit weird. Their post directly says that like um when I saw that what I thought was pretty serious was being dismissed as an annoyance, I used that platform plus a pinch of drama to get them to reprioritize. On that point, like I will say that in
all
fairness to triagers and stuff, they do get a lot of bullshit reports. So like being treat like your issue not being taken immediately as seriously and like them wanting to look into it more, I feel like was taken as kind of a personal attack when it really shouldn't be. It's just the nature of, unfortunately, triagers have to go through a lot of garbage, and so their mind kind of goes to immediately treating things as garbage until proven otherwise, because that's just how it generally is.
Yeah, and I'll mention that, like, from their time of their last disclosure to now, like, bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure programs have exploded. Like, since 2017, like, they still existed back then too, of course, but really over like the 2019, 2020, and like COVID era, uh, they grew like so much during that period. Got a lot more noise going on, a lot more going on. But I will mention, ultimately, like, they did choose to try and hype this vulnerability up. And ultimately it kind of comes across as a bit of a nothing burger, even though it is a uh yeah, it is still like a network on like internal network for the most part, accessible RC, given the fact that you have that user interaction. This was definitely overhyped, and like, the fact that they just present this as unauthenticated RC against all GNU Linux systems, like, they put a lot of publicity on this and overhyped it. And then they also, I think they had another tweet I saw. I'm pretty sure it was from them, calling out, like, infosec influencers. It's like, that's what you're doing here. Like, you're part of that group now. Uh,
Yeah.
I'm trying to see if I could actually find the tweet I'm thinking of, but like, yeah, they're using the platform. They're trying to go that route. Like, yeah,
Yeah. That being said, I will say like the research is cool and the vulnerabilities are interesting to talk about, and they are still problems. I think there are a few too many people that are pendulum swinging too hard in the other direction, where they're like, okay, well, these issues are not important at all, and like I don't agree with that. I think they are still problems. They're still bad bugs. It's just that because they were overhyped, you know, that sort of leads to people treating it less seriously. That's just kind of
yeah.
the
It's
reality of
not
it.
a 9.9, but it's still,
It's still
like,
something that
there's
needs to be
still a
fixed.
real issue here. Like,
Yeah.
that absolutely exists.
Now, one question I have for you, Z, what do you think about that practice of like going full disclosure once the report's been leaked through other channels? Do you think that that makes sense as a way to go? I do, but I'm
Yeah,
just curious on
I
if you
have
have a
no
different.
issue with that.
Okay.
The report was already out there. Like I said, basically, one, it was on like breach form, so it's not like it was like somebody had to pay for access or something, like had some sort of limitation on it. But yeah, even if they did, honestly, like I'd still probably say like, but when it's out there, because at that point you're only privileging the attackers or those with malicious intent who are willing to go through the extra steps to find out about it by keeping things hidden. So at that point, absolutely, like go full disclosure, put everybody on equal playing field.
Yeah, that's my opinion too. Kind of why I was wondering though is I did see some discussion around that aspect, wondering like, well, is it even really that big of a deal that it was leaked? Like, is there actually adversaries that would look to try to exploit this bug and take advantage of that? And I was like, absolutely. There is a market for these kinds of vulnerabilities that are not yet patched or are like sort of that weird space where they're end days, but they're also O days on pretty much every target. Like
Because
there
of
is definitely
the
a market for that, and like attack scenarios where that would be taken advantage of.
Yeah, like you have the hard part because this does require that user interaction on the print, as we understand it. Because if this were just an RC over the network, absolutely useful and all of that. When you need something else there, it's
It's maybe less useful in a broader context, but it still could be leveraged in certain scenarios.
yeah, like in all honesty, I wouldn't even care whether or not it's that useful for like attackers or not. The fact is it
Just on
is out
principle.
there. So on principle,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd want to just say like it's out there, put everybody on equal playing field. Don't try and make the choice that, oh well, this is, attackers or not. Just make everything equal again and move on from there. Is kind of where I'd go. And I do also kind of want to make mention, this came up earlier with the stack-based buffer overflow that they found and stuff. They mentioned how the Compass package itself is covered in OSS fuzz, but this subcomponent they found in the browse daemon is not covered by OSS fuzz. Honestly, like actually even the initial kind of quote they start off here from a generic security point of view, whole Linux system is as it is nowadays, is just an endless, hopeless mess of security holes waiting to be exploited. Um, that's kind of my feeling about a lot of the GNU Linux tools in general, like core utils, and like everything else. Is there's a lot of like ancient C code that has grown into this spaghetti mess of code that I wish we'd kind of move on from, but stick around. And well, I guess in fairness, we are slowly seeing some rewrites, some refactors, some alternatives coming in over some of these core tools that have been used for many years. But like, there is this area where there's just a lot of like low level vulnerabilities. Absolutely, a lot of them. Like, if you found I had kind of joked beforehand before I looked into what this could be. It's like, am I going to find out that LS has a remote attack surface or something? Um, it's like a lot of them are things like that where there are vulnerabilities, there are issues, but like you're not getting a privilege escalation out of it. It's not over the network. Like there's really nothing you're able to do with it. It's just bad code. The cups thing here though, I'd be hard pressed to believe there are like some memory corruptions and some more serious vulnerabilities that possibly even could be exploited over the network. Um,
Yeah.
like I would not be
And that
surprised to
is one of
find that out at
BeetleSocket's
all.
points that he made, in fairness. So,
Yeah.
um,
I imagine
yeah,
there's going to be some researchers taking a bit more of a look at cups now after this too. So there is that kind of
probably.
benefit.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting, bit of a side discussion, but like with what you brought up there seems to have been a lot of effort and work put in recent years on securing things at the OS level. Like Google, for example, with Linux has been putting a lot of work into reducing kernel attack surface, making it so it's harder to attack the kernel in general. And like, there's been research on some of those core system services like dbus and whatnot. But when it comes to the utilities and like cups and things like this, um it's just kind of been left out there as like this ugly thing that just persists across systems for years. And it almost like detracts from all the work that's been done to secure the system, because like, oh yeah, you've done all this work here, but then on the other side of it you just have this like free spot on the bingo card almost. um and it's just one of those problems, I guess, with open source, where it's like there's so much code that needs to be tackled from a security perspective that it's just way too much for the little amount of resources that are given. So you can kind of try to prioritize on the things that you think are more critical, like the kernel and stuff, but then you still have these kinds of problems. So yeah, it's a little bit unfortunate, and it doesn't seem like that's gonna be any better anytime soon.
No, this comes into like our Rust discussion from like what, May or March or whatever. Like I think the way forward is just slowly but surely. Slowly things do, and like people have started rewriting different tools in either more secure languages, refactoring certain tools to make them simpler and like remove a bunch of attack surface. Um Slowly things like that happen, and it does feel like it's generational, where like the old generation of developers are going to stick with doing their C, and those tools are going to stick around forever. But people write new things, newer devs end up trying them, and like slowly over, literal decades pretty much, we start seeing some movement. And that's kind of the way forward as I see it on that front, in terms of getting out of some of this bad code. Is it's just going to be a slow thing, and we're probably going to be held back for a while by people who don't want to move off the familiar tools.
Yeah. All right, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to discuss on this topic. So unless you had something else to bring up, Z, we'll wrap it up.
Uh no, I think that's
There
good.
was a lot of points we went into, so I'm trying to
Yeah,
think if we missed something, but I don't think we did. But
yeah, no, I don't think there's anything really I want to add. We've hit a lot of topics here, hit a lot of things out of this. A lot of good discussion actually came from it. And ultimately, while like this is something that did get hyped up, and therefore when the actual vulnerability comes out as being less impactful than initially thought, you said pendulum, some people are kind of swinging quite far on the other side. There's a real issue here. It is a thing that should be fixed. um but yeah, I mean, this just
and it
seems
is something
like,
to be aware of, just like
yeah, it
as you know, as a sysadmin or whatever.
could be a fun bug to actually abuse in the wild, like on a red team, or yeah, I guess in the wild. When I say in the wild, I am thinking of like red teaming, not against your boss. You go be ethical about it, but it does seem like it would be a fun chain to kind of have if you manage to pull it off.
All right. But that brings us to the end of our episode. So, as always, thanks goes out to everyone who tuned in. And again, we do appreciate some feedback in the comments or in our Discord. And we will see you next week.